Hello, and a massive, big welcome to all you Sherry Bombers to the very first Sherry Bomb Appreciation Society live tasting. This first group tasting event is with Old Perth, who are probably best known for their blended malts, as well as some very impressive special limited small batch Sherry Bomb releases that have appeared over the past few years. Some of you may be aware of what they are. They generally look like awesomely dark, very tempting, things like that. So they are not just the blended malts that we're talking about tonight, but they do other things outside of that as well. For those of you who were successful in the ballot and are taking part in tonight's event, should have received a lovely little tasting map and also some samples of the Old Perth original, the cast strength, and the brand new, not yet released 12-year. So you'll be the first group of people outside of the distillery and the company to try this. So that's really quite cool. We'll be joined and guided tonight by Neil Hendricks, who is Morrison Scotch Whisky Distillers Sales Director and part of their whisky creation team. And he'll be staring us from his location in, I always get this wrong, Aberargie. So if I've pronounced that wrong, I really apologise. I'm sure Justin will probably tell me off for that. They're the home of Morrison Scotch Whisky Distillers, and he'll be taking us through these 3 drams tonight. We're also joined by Justine Hazelhurst, who is a whisky historian with a mountain of knowledge on the Old Perth region and anything around it. And she's also the coordinator of Fife Whisky Festival and owner of Cask Whisky, spelt with a K, and they organise and run whisky tastings and whisky tours. So the evening is going to be about 2 hours, I think, and it's going to be like doing a condensed degree in 2 hours whilst we're drinking whisky. So that's absolutely fine with me. I hope that's okay with you guys as well. But just before I hand over to Neil and Justin, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you Sherry Bomb Appreciation Society members for keeping the page really active, really fun, and always on the go. It's growing really nicely. I'm really happy with it. And the content and the chat is brilliant. So I'll do my best to keep it fresh and moving along, but please don't stop what you guys are doing because, you know, as I've said before in other events, it's the members that actually make the group successful, not the admin. So that's me done. I'm going to take a step back now, and without further ado, I'll be quiet and I'll hand over to Neil and Justin. So Neil, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. And as you can see, the sun is shining, and it's really nice and warm inside the distillery. I'm hoping that the technology plays ball with us tonight. And yeah, good evening, Justine. How are you?
Hi, Daniel. How you doing? You okay?
Very well, thank you. So just before we start, and before we get into the first dram, I'm not going to keep you too long before we get into the first one, because I know what these tastings are like. Just a few housekeeping rules. First of all, I remember doing a tasting probably about 10 or 15 years ago back in South Africa, when we were still allowed to do in-person tastings. And one of the audience members in the front row was on her phone the entire night. And I got really, really offended. And afterwards, I went to the brand manager. I said, who is this person that was on her phone the whole night? Very, very rude of her. And she said, well, it's one of the
Oh dear, I think we've lost Neil at a crucial moment. Okay, so I'll just try and fill in until Neil returns. So as Sean said, oh, here's Sean. Technology's not winning. We're not winning against.
How ironic was that then? As you're talking about technical problems, and then
also
Neil, we lost you for a minute, and you're back.
Gosh.
So you got to the point where the woman was on her phone, and then at the very crucial moment, it kind of cut off.
All right, well, I was highly offended, but I never thought the day would come where I would encourage people to be on their mobile phones and to be on their computers during a tasting. So I'm going to encourage you. We're going to do some tasting notes. So for each whiskey, if you can scan the QR code that will come up to the screen, you can register your tasting note, a single word tasting note. And at the end of the tasting, we'll show the mood board of the tasting notes for each whiskey. Please also ask any questions, put your comments into the chat, and we'll try our best to answer the questions. Okay, and then when we get to the 12-year-old, Sean, we have spoken about the 12-year-old. This is the first time where anyone outside the office, to be honest, will be tasting the 12-year-old Old Perth. It's only due for release in September of this year, and we're going to create a really nice selfie wall. Again, something that I never said or never thought I'd ask for people to take a selfie with a dram of Old Perth 12-year-old, and we'll bring that onto the screen as well. Okay, I think that's housekeeping. I don't have to explain to anyone where the bathrooms are. So we'll get straight into the first whiskey, I think. So the first whiskey is Old Perth Original, and the timing of this tasting is pretty good, in the sense that just yesterday afternoon at around 1 o'clock, we got informed that Old Perth Original won a gold medal at the International Spirit Challenge, which is the first big significant award that we've entered, and we are absolutely delighted with the recognition, I suppose. So a little bit about Old Perth. Some of you may know Old Perth from a few years ago. It is a brand that has existed in the past, and under ownership of Morrison Scotch Whisky Distillers, or Morrison Mackay as we were previously known. But when we did the rebrand in September of last year, we really thought it would be a good idea. We wanted to put a lot of focus on our whiskey brands, and we wanted to make sure that each one of our brands has a very clear identity and DNA. And with Old Perth, looking back in the history of the brand, we decided that Old Perth should be our sherry matured blended malt. And when I say sherry matured, I really do mean fully matured in sherry. It's not a finish. It's not a bit of sherry and a bit of bourbon or some refill hogsheads. Every single malt that we use for any of the Old Perth core range has been matured. It's in its entirety in sherry casks. Now that might be first fill or refill. It might be different styles of sherry, and I know we'll get into the sherry cask discussion a bit later in the evening. But this is fully matured in sherry casks, absolutely no color added, non-chill filtered, and bottled at 46%. There was quite a bit of conversation about bottling at 46% and not adding color, especially from the finance team. But we really felt that, you know, we wanted this to be as authentic as possible. We're a premium whiskey company, and yeah, so we made the decision to take that extra bit and make sure that we don't add any color to any of our products, and we never chill filter.
Neil, can I ask a very quick question about blends in general? So I'm sure most of the people know this already, but the difference between a standard blend and a malt blend, and why malt blends aren't always as cheap as people expect them to be.
Okay, so just on that, people are obviously allowed to carry on and with the tasting. So blended whiskey is a combination of grain whiskey and single malt whiskey. Single malt whiskey is made from malted barley and distilled in a pot still, as you can see, one of these behind me. Grain whiskey is made from various grains and distilled in a continuous or column still. And a blended malt whiskey is where you take two single malt whiskies and you vat them together. And in simple terms, if you take Glenrothes and Bowmore and you add them together for whatever reason, you have a blended malt. Now, in my opinion, the category is completely misunderstood. People tend to think that it is inferior, and they relate it to blended whiskey because it contains the word blend. Now, in my opinion, vatted malt was an easier description to understand because you vat various malts together, but that was taken away, I think, around 2004. And in theory, blended, there's no reason why a blended malt whiskey should be any cheaper than a single malt. Because essentially, we buy single malt whiskey from various distilleries. We pay a single malt price. We blend them together to create Old Perth, blended malt. And the consumer naturally expects us to charge less than we would for a single malt.
Thank you. No, that's good.
So just on the nose, again, you can smell the spices. You can smell the sweetness of the sherry. There's a lovely dusty note for me, which is an indication of wood, which is an indication of fully maturing sherry and not just the finish. And again, beautiful spiciness, spicy notes on the palate. I really enjoy that at 46%. I think it shows a lot of character. However, you know, if people do prefer to add a little bit of water, please go ahead and try. But I'm going to leave you with that, leave you with the dram. And please enjoy that while Justine takes us through a little bit of why Perth and Old Perth. So over to you, Justine.
Okay. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Sean, and thanks to everyone for inviting me along, because it's always fascinating to delve into the history of the Scotch whisky and to track its journey to the present day. And Perth, both in the county, has an immense whisky heritage, which I think is great to tap into. And so we just saw the image of the Old Perth packaging. I don't know if we can get that image back up, because that's a good place to start. It gives us a few cues. It's our starting point, kind of on this whisky history journey. And I just mentioned earlier to Sean and Neil that I am going to try and condense about 200 years of Scotch whisky history into 10 minutes. So wish me luck. But on the Old Perth packaging, we've got a few cues here to get us started. So first of all, you can see the date in between the Old and the Perth. It says 1908. And then underneath Perth, you've got the two words Fair City. So if any of you are fans of Walter Scott's novels, you may be familiar with the 1828 Fair Maid of Perth. And so since that was published, Perth has been known as the Fair City. So that's a reference to that. 1908 is actually referring to somebody completely different, and that's Peter Thompson. And Peter Thompson, he was a spirit merchant, a grocer, and he started his own shop in Perth in 1908. Now Peter Thompson had this immense, vast knowledge of whiskies from the area that we now call Speyside, and he used that knowledge to create and sell his own Scotch whisky blend. So that's 2 points there on the packaging. But one thing that I think you might not be able to see so clearly, but it does say on the carton, the finest sherry matured malt whiskies, specially selected to honour the birthplace of blending. So when we talk about blending, I think sometimes Perth gets a little bit neglected. It gets a little bit overlooked. When people think about blenders, they think maybe of Andrew Usher, based in Edinburgh, maybe W.P. Lowry in Glasgow. I live on the Costa del Leith, and here in Leith, people still, talk about Charles McKinley. That's a name that's quite famous here in Leith for blending. But Perth tends to get a little overlooked in that respect. But it played a huge role, a very significant role, and that was primarily because of its geographical location. So now we get into the real history of things. So we're going to travel back 200 years, okay? And we have a clip here, a little image of a newspaper. It was the Inverness Courier from 1827. And so at that time, there were at least 43 distilleries. So I think the image is going to appear shortly. But when you see it, you'll see that this particular image, this piece from the newspaper, actually lists each distillery's output for, I guess, its total gallons of proof spirits that was made from malt. Okay. If the image covers up, you'll see, okay, it's very small, but you can see that they aren't huge quantities. So most of these operations were either small to sort of medium in size. Now, this refers to a period of time in 1826. So it's between January and July in 1826. And this is 3 years after the Excise Act was passed. So the 1823 Excise Act essentially changed the way in which Scotch whisky was regulated, was taxed. And in doing so, it pretty much wiped out illicit distilling. So it may well be, I mean, there's some names here that still exist, but the vast majority of these distilleries are long, long gone. But it may well be that these distilleries would have originally been the sites of illicit distilling, and at this point, they've become legal operations. Up until 1823, there was one very important piece of legislation, and that was the Wash Act, and that's from the late 1700s, 1784. And this essentially drew a line between the lowlands and the highlands. Okay, so in the highlands, duty was charged on the capacity of the still, but in the lowlands, distillers paid tax per gallon on the wash. So it kind of created not just a divide in tax reasons, but also a divide in the way that whiskey was produced. So whiskey was produced in different ways according to the different regions. I guess in the lowlands, it could be described more as an industry, and in the highlands, dare I use the word craft, but more of a craft. And so up until 1823, all of the government's attempts to tax whiskey production, to try to wipe out illicit distilling, pretty much failed or were even counterproductive. And so as the demand for whiskey increased, so did production, both legal and illegal. And illegal, especially in the Highland region. So whiskey production increased to meet that demand. Now, by this sort of the late 1700s, when the Wash Act was passed, Perthshire and Perth couldn't really be described as this huge distilling centre. But if you look at where it is, it's literally on the boundary between the lowlands and the highlands. And so Perth and Perthshire made for an extremely convenient smuggling hub. Now, when we visit distilleries, we're often given dates as to when they've been established. And there's this almost romantic notion these days that certain distilleries grew from sites where illicit distilling first took place. And if you take, Speyside region, that's obviously an obvious pointing. But essentially, in Perthshire, having been a smuggling hub, out of that smuggling hub evolved a legitimate whiskey hub. So it became even more important as a whiskey hub in 1848 when the railway arrived in Perth. And so the railway brought lots of other developments with it. So in the Victorian age, tourism, because of Britain's railways, you can see here on the screen that this was the Dundee and Perth Railway, and you can see the other lines. So Perth essentially was this railway hub. Now the Victorians became tourists essentially. Britain's railways gave people access to travel the country, and so on the way up north to the Highlands, Perth was a perfectly good stopping off point to break up the journey. Excuse me. And so with this influx of tourists into the city, grocers needed to feed these extra visitors, these extra people. They needed to be fed, they needed to be watered. I guess they also needed to be whiskied, if that's even a verb. And grocers such as Arthur Bell, John Dewar, Matthew Gloag, and Peter Thompson, they all adapted, expanded their business to meet this increase in the demand. So as well as tourists, the railways brought casks of whiskey down from the Highlands, then on to Edinburgh and the Lowlands, and then further south to London, and then bringing also coal to the Highlands to be able to power the stills. So Perth became this very, very important whiskey hub, I guess. So those famous names that I mentioned before, Bell's, Dewars, famous grouse was, originally Gloag's, all these famous names, as well as Peter Thompson, they became really well known for their Perth whiskey blends. So as you can see from the two adverts, we've got an advert coming up for Dewars and we've got an advert coming up for Gloag's. They were described as Perth whiskey. Okay, so they weren't just Dewars whiskey or Gloag's whiskey. It was Dewars Perth whiskey or Gloag's Perth whiskey. So Perth was a place that they were immensely proud of, enough to mention it in their advertising. Perth became synonymous with good quality whiskey. These blends were transported all over the country as Perth whiskey, and of course they were, transported all over the rest of the world. But we have another couple of adverts, because there's one other thing that people would highlight: the small grocers, the small spirit merchants, as well as the bigger guys. They would very much highlight the fact that their whiskies were matured in sherry wood. So we know that sherry cask maturation for whiskies. Here we go. So we've got some small players here, just wine merchants, spirit merchants. These from the 1870s, 1880s, and they most definitely highlight that their whiskies are matured in sherry wood. Now, the sherry casks that they would have used would have been very different to the kind of sherry casks that are used today for Scotch whisky maturation. And so quite a lot has changed over time. But I think you can see the link between, Old Perth and sherry cask matured whiskey and the actual heritage of what these spirit merchants, these blenders were doing way back in the 1870s, 1880s, during this great whiskey boom of the late 19th century. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about sherry cask maturation later on, I think with dram number 2. But yeah, if anybody has any questions about that very condensed Scotch whisky history, please fire them through. Oh.
Oh, quickly, Justine and Neil, I think a lot of people think bourbon matured whiskey came first and sherry matured whiskey came second, but that's not the case, is it?
No, it's not the case, and I won't say too much more because we will cover that.
Oh, is that a spoiler? Sorry.
But you're right, yes. Not until maybe a wee bit later.
I've scuppered part of your script, sorry.
No, nothing ever goes according to plan. We've learned that much over the last 12 to 18 months.
No,
but I think, Sean, you touched on something, and I think whiskey maturation is as misunderstood as the blended malt category. And I know that we will get into that when we get on to the next whiskey, but I think that was a great introduction to, or history about Perth, and it being such a vibrant whiskey city, and not too long ago.
I think as well, we shouldn't underestimate how important the illicit distilled whiskey was. And during this research, I did actually come across a piece whereby there was a small distillery and spirit merchant based in Perthshire, and they were actually making whiskey legally. But because Highland whiskey had such a better reputation quality-wise, and it's all to do with, I guess, the mash bill and the process. As I said, it was more a craft than the kind of industrial volumes that were being created down in the lowlands. So this particular distillery was asked by the spirit merchants who were buying, the spirit dealers who were buying their whiskey, if they could actually come by at night time when it was dark to take the whiskey out of the distillery so that people would think it was being smuggled. It was a legitimate operation, but they wanted the impression that it was being smuggled to give consumers the impression that it was a better quality whiskey. So there are lots of little aspects about that with Perth whiskey, which perhaps, as I say, tend not to be recorded and talked about as much as, say, Glasgow, Edinburgh, etc.
Have we lost Neil again, or is he still on?
I think he's still with us.
Actually, while we're waiting for Neil, I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming up about the original, and I really like Neil's description of it being dusty, and his reasoning behind dusty, which is the woodiness and the oakiness. And I did a review on this a couple of months ago, and one thing I noticed, it's really lovely on the nose, but when you taste it, it's a lot richer on the palate than you would think it was on the nose. So it's there you go. There's a word map that's come up, but I think it's much richer on the taste than on the nose. It's really lovely. It's really good.
And super easy to drink as well, I think.
Oh yeah, very much so. Which isn't always a good thing.
Yeah.
It is lovely to see everyone's opinion, and I think all of those tasting notes really make sense, and you can see where it's coming from.
There's some good ones there. Cashew.
There's an amaretto in there. I'm going to have to look
but
for that.
For me, I mean, those are both nutty. And for me, again, nutty brings you back to the cask and the wood. And I find nutty notes on a lot of sherry matured malt, especially right at the back. Maybe not on the front, but when it settles, I think a nutty note is a really good indication of maturity and good quality sherry wood.
And do you pick up chicken, Neil, on there?
I'm glad you just saw that, Sean, because I'm thinking, oh, chicken.
I've got to find out who you put that.
I wonder whether it's barbecue chicken or...
I've no idea. I'll have to scroll through the comments to see who put chicken down. First.
It's a good one.
I mean, let's be a bit more specific on the chicken.
We'll find it later.
I was going to ask, how much does the Old Perth original retail for, Neil?
It's a shocking, well, it is £32.
That's just a bargain.
That's really, that's really good. That's really good.
So yeah, and I think, Justine, when you spoke about the label and the design of the gift box and the label, you know, what we did take into consideration, and a key piece of inspiration for us was Peter Thompson's shop front with all the different fonts, and I'm really glad that you picked up on that.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, the packaging looks, you know, kind of that era as well. I think with marketing and packaging, sometimes it's, you know, it's to be careful. But I think when the whiskey is as good quality as this, you know, it's kind of to you know, you're not sort of playing games with people. And for £32, it's a fantastic dram, I think. Yeah, definitely. I think you were saying earlier, Sean, that this is a whiskey cupboard staple, is it? So
yeah, it was. I think, in fact, I don't know if he was successful in the ballot, but a friend of mine, Robert Clark, he was round at my house a few months ago, and he said, I think it was something like, this is the kind of a cabinet resident that would always easily, and he was talking about the cask strength, and he said it's a kind of whiskey that you would just live in a cabinet and it will be drunk by yourself or guests, and it's kind of a really good one to keep as a staple.
Yes, it's a very easy drinking whiskey, I think. A good sort of. I think we've lost Neil again. So it's a problem with these things. Sometimes you don't know if you've lost them, or
because he's based in the distillery itself at the moment, and he's probably nipping off to get a nip.
So yeah, Aberagi is in Perthshire, just across. So I'm not sure whether broadband is great there. Oh, and Neil, you're back. Great.
I'm sorry, the Wi-Fi seems to bounce off the condensers in the back.
That's the best excuse I've ever heard. I have to remember that one.
But,
all right, so that was dram 1. Shall we move on to dram number 2, and we'll get into the conversation about sherry casks. And before I start, so this is Old Perth 12-year-old. It's only set to be released in September of this year. So this is officially the first time we are tasting this liquid outside of the office. It's not been bottled yet. So the samples were specifically drawn for yourselves. We've done the vatting. We've put the stock back into sherry wood to rest for a few months. And we'd be looking to be bottling this in the next 2 months. So if you can pick up your glass and you see the colors ever so slightly darker. And can I just remind everyone of the selfie? In fact, I'll do one just now. So besides I mean, this is a completely different blend to Old Perth Original. Similarities are that both are fully matured in sherry wood. The main difference here, besides its age, is that Old Perth Original, we've used Oloroso sherry exclusively, whereas for the 12-year-old, we have included a small percentage of whiskey that was matured in Pedro Jimenez casks, so PX sherry. And the key difference there for me is Oloroso sherry gives you dried fruits, spicy notes, everything that we've experienced in Old Perth Original, whereas PX sherry, and for those of you who are familiar with PX sherry, a very, very high sugar content, think rum and raisin, gives you a bit more sweetness rather than the dusty, spicy note that you get from Oloroso. So this, you think that Wi-Fi outage was an accident?
That's magic.
But this combination of PX and Oloroso gives us a really great balance and complexity. And for me, that is what you would want in a whiskey. You do want it to be complex. You want people to taste it and experience various different flavors. It needs to linger, it needs to change, but at the same time, you want it to be balanced. So not one individual flavor needs to overpower. And on the nose, immediately for me, it is less dusty, less spicy. It's a touch more sweet. And when I say sweet, it's probably stewed fruits, prunes. It's not sugar sweetness. There are hints of caramel. Oh. And again, it's bottled at 46%. As always, non-chill filtered, no color added. Beautifully and chewy. The texture and the structure is a little bit different. It is a little thicker.
It's sweet, then it kind of dries off, and then it leaves a really oily coating in the mouth.
And I think that oily, coaty feeling is the texture that is significantly different to the Old Perth Original. And I really like this. It's chewy.
Mm. It's still got that nice peppery warmth going through it as well. But then there's layers of sweetness, oiliness, dryness, back to oiliness again, and the sweetness comes back. So it's really good. And I think it's what I was hoping, because I hadn't tried it before tonight. So it's kind of what I was hoping it would be like as a 12-year-old compared to the 12-year-old sherry matured whiskies that I normally drink. And I don't know what anyone else thinks on here, but this quite easily squares up to a lot of the 12-year-old single malts that I have and gives it a punch in the face. It's good. It's a really good contender. Well,
the tasting notes are open, so people are welcome to register their notes and let's see what they think.
No chicken at all in this.
So yeah, I mean, we speak about Oloroso sherry and PX sherry, and I wondered, Justine, if you want to take us back and let's talk a little bit about what is a sherry cask, and we do it without trying to completely ruin the romance of the whiskey industry.
I'll try my best, but I might not achieve that. But I think so. Obviously, maturing Scotch whiskey in sherry casks is a traditional part of the process, and I guess everyone's from the Sherry Bomb Whiskey Appreciation Society. So, as far as we're concerned, it's a very important part of the process. But I wonder how many people have actually asked themselves why sherry casks, because there were plenty of other types of casks available. Wine was being imported from various different countries. Spirits were being imported from other countries. So why sherry? Why sherry casks? And I think essentially the answer, it comes down to the fact that the British absolutely loved sherry, and had done from as far back as the 15th, the 16th centuries, and possibly even before then. So from the 1500s, 1600s, sherry was being imported into Britain more and more. And so fast forward to the time of our friends Arthur Bell and John Dewar and all of the other blenders, Peter Thompson, Matthew Gloag, during that whiskey boom period from the mid to the late 1800s. Essentially at this time, and for a good while longer, sherry was being imported into Britain, being exported from Spain in casks. Now we have this romantic notion that these casks have been holding sherry for X number of years before being emptied and bottled, and then the casks are shipped over to the UK and to Scotland to be used by whiskey producers. But that isn't actually the case, and never really was. So the casks that were used to transport the sherry from Spain to the UK were transport casks. They weren't the Solera casks. And the transport casks were made from locally sourced European oak, Spanish oak, rather than American oak for the most part. So I think some transport casks were, I did actually read during the research for this, that some of the transport casks were made of American oak, but I think that was pretty much the exception rather than the rule, because Spanish oak was locally sourced, so therefore it was cheaper, and the American oak, which had to be imported, was more expensive. So American oak was pretty much what was used for making the Solera casks, which would need to be, I don't know, 100, 200 years old sometimes. Okay, so the more expensive wood was used for that. So the transport casks were filled with sherry and then shipped off to the UK. Now that journey probably would only take a few weeks, maybe a couple of months tops. So the sherry was only in the transport casks for a very short period of time. If we look at how things are done today, casks are seasoned with a sherry according to the distillery's requirements. So I guess on that level, there isn't too much of a difference. But for me, I mean, the main difference here is that these transport casks were filled with sherry that was designed to be drunk. So today, sherry casks are seasoned with a young wine, and then that isn't bottled as sherry and sold. It can be distilled into Spanish brandy, I guess. It can be Spanish sherry vinegar, but it was never actually made to be drunk. And if, like, I'm a great advocate for blends, I'm a great advocate for blended malts. They have changed significantly over the years for a whole variety of different reasons. But when you buy these wee gems on the auction sites, you pick up some of the old blends, from the 60s and the 70s. They are noticeably different in their flavor profile. So there are many variables which I guess have contributed to that difference. But maybe one of the differences is the fact that the whiskey was matured in the sherry casks, these transport casks, which contained sherry that was designed to be drunk, whereas today that's not exactly the case. And so I think sometimes people also have this romantic notion that it was just by accident that Scotch whisky producers decided to use sherry casks. And perhaps there was an element of recycling there. Perhaps there was, an element of trying to save money. But it looks as if, like, the distilleries, the blenders, the spirit merchants really went out of their way to source really good quality, decent sherry casks. This was the sought after flavor profile for their consumers. So that's why it was the sought after flavor profile for the blenders. As I said, there were lots of other casks that were being imported, lots of other wines, lots of other spirits and these casks were available available to Scotch whisky producers, but they went out of their way to source sherry casks. And in that respect, there was a huge amount of competition between whisky producers to source the best sherry casks. So with everybody wanting these best casks, sometimes obtaining them became incredibly difficult. And there were certain events over time which made that even trickier. So this is what we were talking, this leads into what we were talking about earlier, Sean, in that we had a period in the 30s, we had the Spanish Civil War, okay? So inevitably that made obtaining sherry casks even trickier. But in around the same time, in the 1930s, a law was passed in the US which stated that bourbon needed to be matured in fresh new casks. So that was kind of convenient for Scotch whisky producers, I guess, because as sherry casks became more increasingly difficult to find, and there were fewer sherry casks available, there was an abundance of bourbon casks available to Scotch whisky producers. So perhaps that's when the shift started, towards sort of ex-bourbon cask matured whisky. We can never really ever sort of pinpoint these things to one particular occasion or event, but maybe that's when the shift started. And then a little later in the 1980s, in 1986, the Spanish government passed a law which prevented sherry being exported in cask. It had to be bottled in Spain. And so these transport casks soon decided to, they were soon dried up. So these things made it more difficult, I guess, for Scotch whisky producers to obtain really good sherry casks. So, where there's a will, there's a way. And so during these periods where it was particularly tricky to get these types of casks, ways were devised to try to overcome those obstacles, I guess. One particular thing, which is quite a controversial thing, was the introduction of a very sweet fortified wine called Paxaret. Now, I've probably absolutely murdered that word. My Spanish is, I speak fluent French, but my Spanish is pretty dodgy. So apologies to any Spanish speakers if I've just absolutely killed that. But Paxaret was, as I said, a very sweet fortified wine, and it was put into, a small amount was put into the cask, and then steam pressure, it was kind of forced into the oak staves, and then when it rejuvenated an old sherry cask, and so when the whiskey was then the spirit was then put into the cask, it imparted the same sort of characteristics, color, flavor, as a sherry cask would. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why some of the old sherry matured whiskies from yesteryear taste a little different to the ones today. Who's to say? I think one of the biggest problems we have is that we don't have a time machine. Major problem. If we did, we'd all be going back to the 80s and stocking up on Brora or Port Ellen, but we don't have a time machine. So we don't know what changes necessarily have occurred in the bottle. There were no actual tasting notes, from these old blends from the 60s or the 70s. And I guess, in addition, it's so subjective that even if they were, they probably would be meaningless. So to say the whiskey has changed, I think we can when we pick up these old bottles, and to say that maybe Paxaret has had some kind of influence on that change, certainly something that's worth considering. Paxaret was not really used after the late 1980s. I think it started to die out anyway. And today, of course, the Scotch Whisky Association would call that an illegal additive. So this isn't something that's used in sherry cask matured whisky anymore. So today, sherry cask matured whisky is a very different process because I can't think of many whiskies that have actually been matured in a genuine Solera cask. I think the Dalmore had one and Tomatin had a release, but apart from that, nothing really comes off the top of my head. These casks are too valuable for bodegas, for sherry producers to just give away. They stay on the premises for what, 100, 200 years. So that romantic notion that sometimes marketing peeps can kind of conjure up isn't necessarily so. And today, Scotch whisky producers have worked incredibly hard to build relationships with sherry producers, with cooperages, etc., to create to season casks, I guess, to create that cask according to their specifications. I think on average, 2 years is the age of the length of the seasoning period. But these sherries that go into the cask to season are particularly young. They're not in there for too long, but they weren't made to be drunk as sherry. As I said earlier, they'll be distilled to make brandy or for vinegar. And so, that's, I guess, a difference. So there are similarities between the transport casks and today in that they didn't contain sherry for very long, but the differences certainly are that the sherry essentially today isn't designed to be drunk. So I think that's a major difference. So I'm not sure how things work with Old Perth, Neil, if I've kind of made any romantic notions.
For me, the important thing, and I did lose you a couple of times just to top up my glass, but for me, the important thing to consider is that the Solera casks, so these casks that are used in Spain, in the Sherry Triangle, for the maturation of sherry, they are merely a holding vessel. Mm-hmm. The sherry doesn't rely on the wood for maturation. It needs oxygen, and it's an oxidative process. Whereas for us, we rely on the wood and that interaction between spirit and wood. So if the wood is dead and not active, that cask is actually of very little value to us. And that's why when we season the new casks with sherry, what we are essentially trying to replicate are these shipping casks, because the wood was fresh. It said that a cask can draw in about 10 or 12 liters of sherry into the wood. So the benefit for us is we get the interaction between wood and we also get the interaction with that sweetness of the sherry. And the cask has two roles. One is a additive effect, where the liquid extracts flavor and particles from the oak. And the second is the subtractive effect, where the charred layer on the inside of the cask serves as a carbon filter and extracts particles from the liquid. And we really rely on that interaction. And I think when you consider full maturation of sherry and a sherry finish, very often when a whiskey is finished in a sherry cask for a short period of time, you end up with a liquid with quite a decent color, but no structure, no body, no depth. And that's why, under each of one of our bottles, you'll see the word patience, because that's one of our key values. And even when you finish a whiskey, you'd want to leave it in the cask for as long as you can, so that it gets the actual interaction with the wood and not just the little bit of sherry that's on the inside of the first few layers. And for me, that's important, and that is key for us when it comes to Old Perth, that all the whiskey that we use, every single cask of single malt that we use in the vatting process, has been fully matured in a sherry cask.
Mm-hmm. Turkey.
I'm just looking at looking at the word map, and there's liver and turkey. I will find that person, and I will ask them where they get that from.
We've got stuffing for the chicken as well. So,
well, I reckon if you take a few ingredients from this tasting map, you could open a Michelin star restaurant.
I'll be honest, I haven't had my dinner yet, and so this is making me absolutely stunning. Yes.
It's funny. Sometimes we get offered some of these old traditional sherry butts, and they could be 40, 60, up to 100 years old. And they are incredibly expensive, and they are incredibly romantic. But reality is that they'd be used as a storage vessel, or they'd be given to the marketing department.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the Solera casks are just, I mean, they're just so valuable that they wouldn't get rid of them for any price. Unless you know, they were broken and they were beyond repair. Those casks, those casks stay there for so many years. So it is this kind of, as I say, misunderstanding, I think, that a vast majority of people have as to what a sherry cask matured whiskey is. When you know what it actually is, doesn't make it any less good, if you see what I mean. It's just over time people have got used to thinking it was this, and that's what they're going with.
I mean, and we.
Sorry, just going through the comments. Sorry, Neil, there. Just going through the comments. So Joe Lawson's just said Glenfiddich do a Solera cask, which I've seen. So where they've labelled the whiskey Solera cask, are they actually? Do you know if they're actually using a traditional Solera to?
I think that relates more to the process as opposed to the cask, because the Solera system essentially is a series of groups of casks. And so I think the maximum you're allowed to take out of each cask is a third of the contents. So so you take a third out of the casks in the oldest group and then top it up with sherry from the next oldest, I guess, and then keep filling it up. And I think that's what Glenfiddich mean by Solera, is that it's a Solera vat that's never emptied. It's not actually matured.
So a Solera for their whiskey rather than a sherry Solera.
Yes, yeah,
and that's a great way to achieve consistency, and we try and use it. Well, we do use a similar system and call it a Solera system, but it essentially means it is fractional blending. So you never bottle or blend everything you have and bottle it. You always top up on your original blend, and that way, you know, for us, it is a very convenient way of, or very important way of ensuring consistency, because we are working with various single malts, different casks of whiskey, and we are trying to create the same product each time. So we would do a large vatting, we would bottle a half of it, and the rest would go back into wood. And the next time we are ready for our next vatting, we would bring that wood in, so to ensure that we are always topping up on the original blend, and therefore have as little variation as possible.
Mm-hmm.
It's good.
I've just seen the comment. Some people are already taking a few sips of the cask strength, I see.
Is that my cue to get on it?
I think that's your cue. That's your cue.
It's a Thursday night after all, you know.
Here's one I prepared earlier. Look at that.
I've got a feeling it's the Germans that have gone for the cask strength. And just welcome everyone from all the markets that are joining us, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from Germany, and obviously here in the UK. Right, so whiskey number 3 is Old Perth Sherry Cask Strength. And there's really no need for me to say sherry, because all the core range or all the Old Perth whiskies are sherry matured. So the cask strength is a whopping 58.6%. It is all the power and intensity that you can imagine. At the moment, this is the same blend or the same whiskey as Old Perth Original, but at cask strength. And it is quite interesting to see what a bit of water does. Now, I've had this in my glass for a wee while, just to let it settle and open up a little bit. Huh?
Oh, looks like we've lost Neil again. I was just looking at a few of the comments.
Is he gone again? Okay, so I think he's right. There's definitely a similarity between the original and the cask strength, definitely. But obviously with the powerful hit of the alcohol, weirdly, I think there's actually more of a, now that the original has been in the glass quite a long time, and the cask strength has been in the glass for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I'm actually getting more of a sherry influence on the original than I am on the cask strength, which I'm quite surprised about on the nose.
Maybe just because it's opened up, it's been in the glass for a wee while.
But yeah, perhaps. I mean, yeah, maybe.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
That's okay. You're just keeping us on our toes, aren't you, Neil?
I was just saying that I've poured this at the start of this tasting, so it's been in my glass for a while. So it's had some time to settle. But on the nose, you should be able to pick up a lot of similarities between this and the original. But also, for me, almost more importantly, quite a bit of difference. It is certainly more powerful. I get a bit more depth. I don't necessarily pick up a big increase in alcohol, even though there is a significant increase. But I get a lot of depth. Again, lovely richness. And it would be very interesting to see the tasting note board of this one compared to the Old Perth Original. But this is certainly a very powerful dram. It's
quite drinkable without water as well, which, given its was it 58.6%?
You know what the funny thing is, Sean? For me, I'm cask strength whiskey very often, in my opinion, don't take water as well as whiskey that's bottled at 43 or 46%. And I think the reason for that is when you add water to a cask strength whiskey, you break up the structure quite quickly, and in my experience, it tends to go flat, and it's as if the alcohol is more pronounced once I've added water.
Yeah, I would agree with that. With many whiskies I've had where you add the tiniest bit of water and all of a sudden it's almost like a volcano erupting because there's so much heat and the alcohol comes to the fore, whereas it wasn't. You think you're drinking between a 55 and a 60% alcohol whiskey. You think that's going to be really powerful, and some of them aren't, even though they're at that ABV. And as soon as you put a little bit of water in it, it's almost like poking a volcano, and all of a sudden it's really hot, very peppery, very kind of like loads of heat in the mouth. And you're right, the structure does seem to fall apart. It's quite strange. And with a vatted, diluted whiskey, you can add water to many 43, 46, 40%, and the flavor's still there, and the structure doesn't get affected as much. So I can't quite get my head around that, because in my head, it should be the other way around.
Yeah, but for me, it's all about how that alcohol is integrated into the spirit. And for me, in this cask strength, it's held together by its structure. Now, as soon as you add water and you break that up, the alcohol molecules are just going to come out, and that's all that you'll get. Whereas at the moment, you get all the flavor, you get the depth, you get everything else. And when we add water, because essentially all we're doing to this to create the original is adding water, we do it in a controlled environment. We let the whiskey rest for a few months before we bottle it. And that's why I think when you do add water to original, it will actually take it better and keep the flavor more than if you were to add it to the cask strength.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So the original and this cask strength don't have an age statement, but is there like a kind of rough age on average for the whiskey, for the whiskies?
Yeah. Again, it depends on who you ask. Finance will tell you it's too old, but at the moment we use between 7 and 12-year-old stock.
Mm-hmm.
Which is significantly older than you would expect
for
a whiskey at this price.
Yeah, I mean, not that age matters, but I think those people who are, if a whiskey's good, the whiskey's good. It doesn't.
But we don't have an age statement restriction, so at the moment that is what we use. If we in the future find that we have some older or some younger stock that fits the flavor profile. We have the freedom to use that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
I'll ask a probing question here, Neil. So, what's out of the three that we've tried tonight?
Yeah.
What is your favourite?
Cask strength.
Don't plead the fifth.
No, I should tell you that they're all unique in their own right, and I have a different time for each one of them. But the cask strength for me is the one that stands out, and the reason for that is I'm typically very cautious of any whiskey north of around 54%. And when we tasted the cask strength, as it came out, I was a little bit concerned. But to be honest with you, as you mentioned earlier, I don't necessarily pick up the alcohol on this. I get a mouthful of flavor. I get a big, heavy dram. And for me, it hits every single note. It is... Yeah, this is for me my
Oh, we've lost it. I just thought of a great question for him as well.
Oh, no. I thought that was a tricky question. It's a bit like asking someone who's your favorite child, I think.
But I think he's right. I think it works better without water, because as soon as you put the water in, it just kind of loses its not personality, but it just kind of like fires up a bit.
But I guess that's the beauty, isn't it, of whiskey, all different whiskies. You know, some, as you said earlier, you can add a few drops of water. It'll improve it. Some, it'll just kill it. You don't know until you try, I guess. And it's highly subjective. So whereas one person will prefer it with water, another person will prefer it without. And yeah, if we all like the same thing, a bit boring.
It would be very, very, very black and white, wouldn't it? So yeah. Neil, as you just disappeared, I had a question that I just thought of, and I'll forget if I don't ask it now.
Full
so
glass.
running the sherry, or creating and running the Sherry Bomb Appreciation Society page, and obviously it's all about sherried whiskies. And the reason I set the page up originally years ago was because of my love of distilleries like Glendronach and Tandu and Glengoyne. Where do you see yourself going as a company, and the Old Perth specifically, within the sherry cask whiskey arena? And do you see any particular, I'm making this up as I go along here, do you see any particular distilleries as your main competitors that you want to compete with?
Well, first of all, I'll take that as a very big compliment, because if we consider other distilleries as our competitor, it means that we are considering single malt whiskey as our competitor, and we are a blended malt whiskey. And for people to put us into that league or judge us against single malt whiskey is probably the best thing we can ask for, and we can stand up to it and sit next to them on shelf. Then we've achieved our objective. But yeah, we want to give people sherry matured malt whiskey for whiskey enthusiasts that is affordable to drink on a regular basis. And I would like every Sherry Bomb fan to have a bottle of Old Perth in their cupboard at any given stage.
Yeah, and that kind of links back quite nicely to my friend's comment about the bottle of Old Perth that's in the cabinet as a constant kind of taker of space on that shelf. And I think it's more about the category of sherried whiskies rather than blends versus blended malts versus single malts. It's about the category of sherried whiskies, because you can get some absolutely amazing sherried single malts, and you can get some absolutely appalling sherried malts, and ditto for the blended category as well. And I think since I bought a bottle of the Old Perth Original probably 4 or 5 years ago from Craig at Tyndrum Whiskey, and at the time I was actually quite surprised at the fact that it was a really, really cheap bottle of whiskey, and it was actually really good. And then very recently I've got back into the Old Perth brand, and I think it's actually changed in the last few years since I bought my last bottle, and it seems to be even better. And I think,
but it has changed significantly.
Yeah. And in what way has it changed? Just the recipe, or the
well, besides the brand, the liquid has changed significantly since January of this year. We are now much more in control, and I say in control. We were in control of what we used. We are much more selective and in control about what we use when it comes to creating Old Perth. In the past, I think we had a lot of freedom that we could almost use whatever we had, whereas at the moment we are restricted to using sherry matured single malt from the Speyside region in Scotland, and we are very specific as to where those whiskies come from, what type of sherry it's been in, and what proportions of each whiskey we use. So, now our business has changed significantly since September of last year. And I'm very pleased that people are realizing that. In terms of us as a corporate identity, as a business, our brands, but also our liquid quality.
Yeah, no, it's really good, and that's kind of part of the reason why I was really keen to do this tasting event with you guys, because it covers multiple bases for me. So it covers a sherried whiskey base, it covers the affordability base, but also it's a bit of a left field company as well, because as I said earlier on, even though you're a well-established brand and you have heritage and history, not that many people know about Old Perth. They may have seen it on the shelf, but haven't really registered what it is. And I think that's why, for me, it's really nice to be able to do this with you, because it's almost like, I don't know, just bringing something that's always been there to the fore on the group, and just to kind of like introduce the Sherry Bomb members to it. And I think it's a solid whiskey. It's a really good sherried solid whiskey, and again, the price point is bang on. I think it's really, really good, and I don't see any issue with me going into a shop and buying a bottle of this without thinking, should I buy this or should I buy something else? Because I think it's bracketed itself in its own little category for me. It's a proper.
Well, again, thank you for the compliment, because that's exactly what we aim to achieve. That, and bringing whiskey back to Perth. And Justine, if you want to maybe take over and tell us a little bit about what's happened in this region.
Yeah, absolutely. So Perth hit a very high point as a successful whiskey location, and then it kind of dropped off again. So if anybody watching is as old as me and remembers the 1980s, you'll remember well that it was a time of atrocious haircuts and dodgy fashion choices, but it was also a pretty abysmal decade for the Scotch whisky industry as well. So, coming up to the early 1980s, these Perth brands were hugely successful. So we had Bell's. I think Bell's was the best-selling whiskey in the UK. We have a very dark photo there of the Blackford Hills, I think. So we've got, Bell's was the best-selling whiskey in the UK. Dewar's was like a phenomenal global whiskey brand, still is. And the Famous Grouse, I think, was the best-selling Scotch whiskey in Scotland. So Perth was a hugely successful whiskey location, whiskey city. But in the 1980s, the downturn in the demand for Scotch whisky was on the horizon. So there was a global economic downturn, and also a very definite shift in people's preference towards lighter spirits. So the trend was more towards vodka, white rum, and there was less of a demand for Scotch whisky. So this became a time of amalgamations, consolidations. This all took place as sales of Scotch whisky were plummeting. As you probably know, lots of distilleries were closed. I mentioned Brora and Port Ellen earlier, so they were two very well-known casualties. But many other distilleries were closed during the 80s. And I guess this was the beginning of the end of Perth's very own whiskey boom in that respect. So in 1985, Guinness purchased Bell's. And then the company later went on to buy DCL, Distillers Company Limited. And so those two companies joined together to form United Distillers, and then that subsequently merged with International Distillers and Vintners, and it became the spirits division of the IGO. And I always find when I'm trying to look into the history of certain companies, it's a little bit like that, who do you think you are program, when people are sort of tracing their family trees. often so convoluted, so many takeovers, amalgamations, acquisitions, brands being dispersed elsewhere because of competition law, and it's this whole mishmash of sort of intertwined links between the companies. This became the Spirits division of Diageo. Sorry, Bell's became the Spirits division of Diageo, and then gradually, bit by bit, parts of Bell's production was moved away from Perth. And I think it was 1998. That was the year I first started teaching. So yeah, 1998 was when all the very last link that Bell's had with Perth was cut, and the sales and marketing headquarters were moved from Cherrybank down to England. I think Harlow in Essex is where they moved to. So Dewars, the other great Perth name, that was part of Distillers Company Limited since the 1920s. So when Guinness acquired DCL, they also acquired Dewars. And in 97, they merged with Grand Metropolitan, formed Diageo. The following year, Diageo sold Dewars to Bacardi. So Bacardi are now the current owners of Dewars. If you've ever bought anything from Whiskey Auctioneer, you'll know where Inverarmond is, and that's where the bottling plant was for Dewars. That was closed in the early 2000s. So all links to Perth were then, stopped. 1999, Edgington, as you probably know, Neil moved the offices from Perth to Glasgow. So that pretty much was the end of these big names links to Perth. But I guess over the last 12, 18 months, we've had enough doom and gloom to last us a complete lifetime. So I'm not going to end on that point. I'm going to end on a more positive note and just talk about the current sort of whiskey landscape in Perth. It's now abundant. We've got new distilleries, established distilleries. We've got quite a lot going on the Perthshire whiskey scene. So many of you will be familiar with Glenturret, one of the oldest distilleries in Scotland. So now owned by a Swiss company since 2019, Art and Terroir. And I think I saw recently that they've just opened their new Lalique restaurant. So we've got a huge boost there. Tullibardine, been owned by a French company, Picard Vin et Spiritueux, since 2011, so about 10 years now. Somebody we know quite well through the Fife Whisky Festival, Tony Reman Clark. He founded Strathern Distillery, tiny sort of micro distillery, recently bought by Douglas Lang 2 years ago, 2019. So new lease of life for that, big injection, I guess, of cash as well. Edgedower was once the smallest distillery in Scotland, no longer has that claim, but certainly one of the prettiest, and that has been refurbed and expanded. And then, of course, you still have the well-known distilleries like Blair Athol, the home of Bells, Aberfeldy, owned by Dewars. I'm not sure whether I can class Deanston as a Perthshire distillery or not, but I'm a big fan of Deanston, so I'm just going to include it anyway because it's not too far from there. So, we've got 7 really established distilleries, and now, of course, in Perthshire, we've got the 8th distillery, Aberagi, one of the co-directors of the Fife Whisky Festival, and Aberagi is literally just across the boundary line from Fife to Perth. So we call them honorary Fifers when they attend the Fife Whisky Festival. And so, Aberagi is the new kid on the Perthshire whiskey block, so to speak, which is where Neil is beaming in from this evening. And I guess what interests me the most about Aberagi is, well, from an old Perth perspective, will there be a new Perth? And but also the spirit that's being produced in Aberagi at the moment, is it being filled into sherry casks, and will it make an appearance in the Old Perth blend at some point in hopefully the not too distant future?
That's a lot of questions. So I'll try. So yeah, I am inside Aberargie Distillery. This is the home of Morrison Scotch Whisky Distillers. This is where we mature, we blend all our products, and we have a bottling facility on site. The distillery is a purpose-built distillery. It was established or built in 2017. And it sits on a barley farm, essentially. So the window behind me, if the sun wasn't beaming in, you could see the beautiful golden promise in the background. So we are producing a single malt. It will be bottled at some stage as a single malt. And when it is bottled, it will be a grain to glass operation where we grow our own barley. We exclusively distill from our own barley. We mature everything on site. We have the bottling facility on site. So when we are ready for Aberargie to make an appearance as a single malt, then everything will be done on site, which is a fascinating and a lovely.
Oh.
Sean, we were talking about Aberargie a few days ago. I was talking to Neil and Mark, and I haven't actually managed to visit the distillery yet. They don't have a visitor centre as such, and they're not, welcoming tourists. So I did sort of park up in my car and just had a little sort of nosy about and just hope that I wasn't going to get chased off by anybody, like security or anything. But it's a fascinating distillery, and as you can see from the picture, just looking from the outside, it does look quite it's imposing, I guess. This is what I'm trying to say with these wonderful stills, from the window. But it is very much sort of tucked in the countryside, and you would probably drive past it really not knowing that the distillery was there at all. So much under the radar. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't help with it being camouflaged green, does it?
Or maybe, I think maybe that's done on purpose. So that,
maybe. Yeah. So Justin, how long has Aberargie been operating for?
I think 4 years. I think it has been in production. I think the first whiskey must be about just whiskey, I reckon, just now. Neil's back. He could probably answer that much better than
November 2017.
Fantastic. Okay, 4 years. Yeah.
I just got that.
You keep nipping off.
So I just got that question. So November 2017, the stills ran for the first time. So we do officially have whiskey in the warehouse that you can see on the picture. But once again, at the bottom of each bottle of Old Perth or Mactala or Cardmore, you'll see the word patience. And that's what we need for Aberargie. So at the moment, the site is just to the left of the distillery. There's another small building, which is our office. And behind that, we've got a bottling facility. We have another warehouse behind the distillery. And at the moment, this site is used to create, to blend, to bottle our current whiskey portfolio, which includes Old Perth, Mactala, which is our Islay single malt Scotch whiskey, and Broeder, our whiskey liqueur. And we also do our Cardmore bottlings from here. So all the cask selection, the vatting of Cardmore, both strictly limited and celebration of the cask, gets done on site while the distillery is running in the background.
So Neil, when in the past when you've released things like this, how often do you think will you continue to kind of produce bottles like this, and if so, how often would that be, do you think?
Yeah, so for us, that's probably the most famous bottle of Old Perth that you've just shown. For us, it's important to focus on the core range. So original cask strength and 12-year-old. However, in September of this year, we will release our first Old Perth vintage collection, and that takes back to the Old Perth 13-year-old. So that whiskey that you had there is actually a 2004 vatting of Macallan and Highland Park, and we will continue the vintage. Well, we refreshed the vintage collection, but in the past we did have a 1994 Old Perth. These are all single casks that we bottled. So the vintage collection will be introduced in September of this year.
Okay. Great.
I'm wondering if we're going to get any chicken or turkey notes with this one.
Other tasting notes for the cask strength up.
Sure. There's a question there about the ABV varying over batches. So cask strength or batch strength. I wondered. That's a good question.
So at the moment we're still on our first batch, and the batch is of a decent enough size. So at the moment it is 58.6%. That may change in the future, but I think with careful blending and the Solera system that we use.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I'm trying not to have a grin on my face while I read this.
It should not be too far off that.
Yeah. Hi, that's interesting.
I have to.
So what do we have?
Isn't that great? And I'm sort of checking, but I've just seen bottles, which is
That's high.
pheasant. Okay, we've got pheasant. We've got all the poultry now, I think.
Gamey, yeah. Haven't had ostrich yet. I think, yeah, it's a good job we're limiting it to 3, because if we did 5 whiskies, we'd probably end up having things like, I don't know, tiram salata or something like that, or curry.
Yeah, but it's obviously, I think there's quite a common, those sort of old leathery kind of dry fruit notes coming through on these tasting notes.
So someone's put durian on there, and durian is probably the foulest smelling fruit on the face of the planet. So I think someone might have COVID.
Oh, it's not too shabby a way to test.
I have been reminded to take another selfie and
how do we
post
do
it on
that, Neil? How are people going to do? How do people do that? Literally on the screen.
Yeah, I think there was the hashtag Old Perth SBWAS. It says at the bottom.
So
I'll take a wee selfie.
But Justine, again, to answer the question about Aberargi, yes, we are filling into some sherry wood. Yes, we are also filling into some bourbon wood. So the first year was really experiment. I would suggest with regards to fermentation times and the mash bills and how we run the stills. But I think after 3 years, we're at a really comfortable stage where we are very, very happy with the spirit that's coming off. And now it's for us to make sure that we put it into really good quality wood. And then, in all fairness, the next few years, well, the rest is pretty much out of our hands until we decide that we've got a liquid that we are really happy with and that we're happy to put in a bottle and put our name on it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But it is great to be for the Morrison family at least to be back into distilling. They've been in the whiskey industry for 5 generations as brokers, blenders, distillers, traders, And after selling Morrison Bowmore in 1994, building Aberargi, they've been back in the whiskey business, but building Aberargi distillery brought them back into the world of distilling and actually owning your own liquid, and creating your own liquid, which is really important and great for us to have. Yeah.
And as you said, Neil, it's grain to glass, isn't it? So you're doing everything locally. There's no importing of any ingredients at all. So it's all local.
Absolutely. But I think it's such a privilege to be able to do that. So yeah, a bit of patience required from everyone, both the consumer, but I can tell you from the people here in the office, the staff, they as eager as anyone to get Aberargi bottled and out. So
a question to both you, Neil, and to Justine. So obviously, aside of these guys, what's your other go-to whiskey? What's your favorite distillery that you would reach for?
Neil, do you want to go first, or?
Gosh, I mean, I've got a real soft spot. I'm going to say, and you're not going to believe, but for Bowmore, it's the first distillery that I stayed at. So my whiskey life started in 1999. I worked in a whiskey bar in South Africa, and I came across to Scotland in 2003 to do a work experience at Gleneagles Hotel. And they had a really good relationship with Bowmore because they were selling large amounts of black Bowmore at the time. So I got invited over to the distillery, and I stayed at this distillery one night. So that was my first distillery experience. And it's quite funny how I've ended up here 20 years later. But yeah, Bowmore. And the other one for me is Glenmorangie. It's been a very important part in my whiskey journey and my working life. I worked for Moet Hennessy for more than 10 years in Africa and in London. And I still think Glenmorangie Original is one of those, it's opposite to Old Perth. It's one of those whiskies where, and I remember in South Africa, when it's really hot, you want something light, you want something fresh, and it is an absolute belter of a whiskey for drinking. So yeah, but Glenmorangie and Bowmore will always have soft spots in my whiskey cupboard and my heart.
I would say for me, so the very first bottle of single malt that I bought for myself was Glenord, and at that time it was in the kind of square, sort of cube-shaped bottle. So obviously Glenord is no longer bottled as a proprietary bottling for the UK, except at the distillery, and I think maybe possibly travel retail when we're allowed to buy whiskey at airports again, if that ever happens. So a couple of friends recently visited Glenord and picked me up a couple of their distillery exclusives. So Glenord is certainly not a go-to dram, but it was the first single malt that I bought myself. And so it's a bit of a favorite. But I think a go-to dram for me is old bottles of Hanky Bannister. So it's not a whiskey that perhaps a lot of people know too much about, but it was always in my dad's whiskey cupboard. And I do remember it must have been sort of late 1980s. They went on holiday to what was then Yugoslavia and left me at home. They said I could stay at home as long as I had a couple of friends stay with me. And so we went to the pub that night, me and a couple of reliable, trustworthy friends, and they let slip that I was staying at home alone whilst my parents were on holiday. So as we took a taxi to get home, outside, There were like, I don't know, 20, 30 people all ready to party, and I wasn't really expecting them. But everything ended well. It was fine until about, I don't guess, about 3 weeks after my dad and mum returned from holiday. And my dad went to pour himself a dram of Hanky Bannister, and it had been replaced with cold tea. So I always say I'm amazed that I've lived to tell that story. One of the wonderful things about Hanky Bannister for me now is that it was originally bottled in Leith, pretty much next door to where I actually live now. So I always source these really old bottles of Hanky Bannister from the 60s and the 70s. They're real sherry matured whiskies. They're absolutely phenomenal. So you could just sip on that all evening. So yeah, Hanky Bannister and Glenwood.
That's great. That's great. I love the stories that go behind why you have a favourite whiskey. Whether you like it or not, it's kind of there's history there, isn't there?
Yes. That's the wonderful thing about whiskey. It's not just the liquid, is it? It's everything else that goes with it.
Yeah.
And absolutely. And when people are, I mean, it's easier for me to name a distillery that I've got a soft spot for than my favorite whiskey, because your favorite whiskey, gosh, the one in your glass, I suppose. But I just saw a question pop up whether Old Perth is considering a portwood expression or finish. For us, it's really important that, you know, we are very clear that Old Perth is a sherry matured malt. So whether we do the core range, original cask strength 12-year-old, or our vintage collection that will be launched in September, all of them exclusively sherry matured malts.
Mm-hmm. And always Oloroso and PX, no other types of sherry casks?
For the moment, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you source your casks from the same area in Spain, or do you spread your wings over multiple?
That's a good question. So some of the liquid come in, we order it in from various distilleries according to our specification, and we specify whether it's first fill or second fill or refill sherry wood. But we don't necessarily have control exactly where that wood comes from. The stock comes to site, we have a look at it. If it needs to be re-racked into fresh wood, we will do that from wood that we source ourselves. So I suppose to answer your question, some of the wood we have absolute control over and we source ourselves. Some of the malt we have on site from various distilleries, and some of the malt we actually order in to our specification from distilleries that we have agreements with.
Right. I'm just looking at the comments. So Stuart Botterill saying he's Googling Hanky Bannister now.
It's actually a pretty good blend today, I think. Maybe some people disagree with me, but I don't mind it. But it's just, if you compare it to some of the old 60s and 70s bottles, I've actually got an old bottle from the 50s, which I'm dying to open. It's just a completely different whiskey. So I believe that the people who, the company where it was bottled had the license to use Glenfarclas in their blends. So whether or not that means that Hanky Bannister has got some Glenfarclas in, I don't know. But it's a real sherry cask mature whiskey.
I'm going to have to look up one of those now myself. I think I've never had it, so you've got me me thinking.
It's amazing how few people have actually heard of it. But as I say, for obvious reasons, you know, the fact that somebody replaced my dad's bottle with cold tea, I'm always going to remember Hanky Bannister, and that name is like engraved in there.
I've just seen another question from earlier on from Simon Parker, and it's Sean. Do you see a future deployment of Old Perth single cask for the group? As it's on a public forum, I can't really ignore it, can I? So Who knows, Simon? Who knows?
That's putting you on the spot there. So how long has the group been going, Sean, by the way? That's one thing.
It's been going since 2014.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think 2014. Yeah. And I remember, because obviously Glendronach, I used to run a page called The Gas for Glendronach. And I was trying some different sherried whiskies, and I thought, well, there is no group, like a social media group, just for sherried whiskies. It's either, you know, Malt Maniacs, obviously, and other big groups, and then distillery specific groups. And I thought, well, if there isn't a sherry whiskey group, I'll make one. So I created that, and I always thought it would kind of fizzle out and wouldn't be very successful. But ironically, it's been the one that's looked after itself because of the members, and also because it's such a it's not just one distillery, so there's a lot more scope for lots of distilleries and lots of consumers, and, you know, people talking about lots of things. So it's been kind of like the almost like the pet that you didn't really have to look after too much because it looked after itself. Got my microphone there, and it's been really lovely to watch grow, because I've, you know, I haven't had that much. I've had input into it, obviously, and, you know, and my other admins and mods have helped me kind of run the group really well. But as I said at the very beginning of this tasting, it really is the members that make it what it is. And if it was just me on the group, it would be rubbish. It wouldn't be anything. But it's everyone else feeding in and coming up with things that I've never heard of all the time, and, you know, it makes you think, oh, I'm going to have to try that, and I'll do reviews of stuff that other people haven't heard. So it's really collaborative. Mm-hmm. So it's been going since 2014, and I think it's been a really good group, and it's been really fun for me as well, because it's you learn something pretty much every day. You know, you see a new post come in, and it's stuff that I didn't know about or haven't heard of, or something that I didn't realize was out there. So it's quite good. It's quite niche as well, because it's a specific type of cask finish whiskey. So it's it's not like a lot of the other groups, which is quite nice. There you go. It's a long answer to a very easy question.
Like long answer. I've just seen Joe Lawson's question pop up. It's a bit similar to what you said about a Manzanilla cask release in the future.
Well, at the moment, it is Oloroso and PX. We do have some Fino, we have some Amontillado, we have some Manzanilla. We do have some various sherry casks on site. So let's see what happens to that. Mm-hmm. And I saw another question with regards to the next limited edition Old Perth. And I suppose our next limited edition is the Vintage Collection, which will be a 1996 Vintage Collection, fully matured in sherry. We're going to break away a little bit from the core. Say that again.
Sorry, Neil, I spoke over you again. So, how on that vintage release, how many distilleries would that be across in the blend?
A small amount. It's.
I don't want to probe too much, because it's probably you can't say, you probably don't want.
No. I mean, we don't release the distilleries or name them. But we are going to break away slightly from the core range being exclusively from Speyside distilleries, where the Vintage Collection will be outside of Speyside. Obviously, Speyside as its core, but it will also include malt from outside of Speyside, potentially even Islay.
Right. Okay.
I think there was a question earlier, Neil, about how many casks there are that make a batch of the cask strength. I'm not sure if you mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, that could be depending. It obviously depends on the batch size, and it depends on how much stock we have sitting in the Solera system. It could be 20, it could be 50. It really depends on the batch size. They do vary depending on the time of the year, depending on our forecast, and crucially depending on how much stock we have sitting in our Solera system.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the bigger runs we do, the more we can bat at a time, the better for us, because it does give us the opportunity to create real consistency. So we try and do fairly large runs, yeah.
Cool.
There's a question on screen from Sashin. I think I pronounced that right. Sashin. How does Paxarat compare to today's sweet sherries?
Well, I haven't personally tried Paxarat, so I won't be able to compare. But I know it's made from the PX grapes, and I did read somewhere that it maybe sometimes has a slight bitterness to it, but I've never tasted it, so I wouldn't be able to be able to compare that. I don't know if you've ever tasted it, Neil.
I've not. The fascinating thing for me about this whole change is that, you know, when you mention the dates of 1986, when sherry had to be bottled in Spain, and you know, these are fairly recent developments, and it's funny that when we think about the whiskey industry, we think about the history 100, 200 years ago, and yet single malt whiskey and blended whiskey as it exists today is fairly new.
I think, yeah.
So Neil, pressure's on now. You see, Simon Parker's just posted a comment up on screen. So, you know.
Well, I reckon if we get enough support from this group,
I don't think you need to ask that. I really don't think you need to ask that. You know, you'd probably be able to get rid of a bottling of a single cask PX release in the blink of an eye. You're instant consumers right here.
That's, yeah, you won't have to spend anything on the marketing there.
Oh, it's all done. It's all done for you. All the PR, the marketing, everything.
Well, if I cut off on the Wi-Fi one more time and I get to pour myself another glass, then why don't we have a conversation?
Well, no, everybody on this call just heard that. Okay, so there you go.
Fantastic.
I'm quite picky though.
Sean, are you going to have to taste them all first for quality control?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the worst part, you know, tasting them.
Oh well, somebody has to.
Right, so I think we might be out of questions unless I've missed anything. Yeah, I think that's it. So
well, I'd just like to say, Sean, to yourself and everyone of the group, thank you so much for your enthusiasm on the brand. A special thank you to our friends in Netherlands. I know Marcel is on here, but to everyone of your group, you know, it's been absolutely phenomenal engaging with you and talking to you, and it's fascinating to see the enthusiasm and the knowledge of the group, and Justine for your knowledge on Old Perth as a city, as a whiskey capital, and as a brand. It's been lovely to have you, and thank you so much.
No, thank you for asking me.
Yeah, so Neil, it's been lovely virtually meeting you and hearing about where you are, what you're doing, what the company's doing, and taking us really nicely through the three whiskies that we've tried tonight. And especially thanks to Mark in the background as well, who has been part of the organisation of getting all these tasting packs all over the UK and in Europe. I dread to think what logistical headache that must have been. But Justine, I've got to say, I'm quite in awe of your knowledge and the history lesson that you've taken us through tonight. Absolutely brilliant, top notch. And I haven't been on a tasting before where we've covered that kind of history. So I think kudos to you. I mean, that was absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for that.
I mean, 10 minutes obviously doesn't do it justice.
Yeah, but the thing is, don't ask any questions because I probably won't remember most of the answers.
But yeah, no, it's fascinating researching it as well and looking through. I mean, I spend a lot of my time looking at old maps and looking through old newspaper articles, and some of the stories are fantastic. So yeah, I enjoy doing it as much as I doing all the research.
It was lovely. It was a nice compliment to running through the whiskies as well. So it's a good talking point and a bit of education. So cool. Thank you very much for that.
It's grand.
Okay.
Oh.
And obviously a massive thank you to all of the bombardiers on the Sherry Bomb Appreciation Society. I hope none of you have fallen asleep listening to me or going through this tonight, and I hope you all found it really interesting and enjoyable. And thank you all so much for being part of it. It's been great. It's been, as the first official tasting for the group as well, it was quite a big thing for me because I wanted to make sure it was interesting and engaging for everyone. So I hope I've ticked boxes with that for you. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's it. Anyway, cheers, Slanger.
Cheers, everyone.
Yeah.
Great selfie.
Oh God, there's Ross. There's Joe. There's Matt. There's Mr. Venables. Love it with the dodgy shirt.
Great new haircut, Joe. Loving that.
That's great. Fab. And so, can people still submit their photos for the selfie wall, or is that it now?
Yes, I think they can still submit it to Instagram. Absolutely.
Great. Good. Okay. I think we're done.
That's great.
That'll be great. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.